You've given all of us lots of food for thought. I've got lots of questions, but Žižek goes first.
First, I must say that I was so enthusiastic listening to you that I almost became a Derridean. No, in the sense of, when it was fashionable when Derrida was in to fight the linear metaphysical notion of time. And my idea was, couldn't we stretch time with you in a like 40 minutes would be 1 hour and 40 minutes, So I will try to leave some time for the debate just to raise some questions. But first, I was very touched by your introducing remark, and if I can briefly answer them. Yes, we personally didn't meet, but for me at least, it was something like, it's very personal what I will say. I read in a book on Andrei Tarkovsky that, in his last years, the only place that he could get money to do a movie was Sweden. So he got an office there preparing Sacrifice, his last film, in the same building where Ingmar Bergman had also an office. But they took care of never meeting each other, precisely because they had such a respect for each other that they were afraid, So I think I would say even another thing. Many people tell me, but he is a Zionist, he should be your enemy, or whatever, no? And what's my answer to them? Not this stupid, no, but I say something different. I refer to that stupid American, or even in English, you have it here, phrase. You remember when you have a friend who is a clumsy, stupid friend who does a lot of damage to you, and then the saying is, with friends like this, who needs enemies? Well, with you, I would say maybe we are enemies, but with enemies like you, who needs friends? That's what I would say. Let's go on. There are so many things to say, so I would like to be short. For example, when you mention that ideal revolution and so on, I think you have it in the book, a wonderful distinction which have, if you know history of theory, great echoes from Lacan to Hegel. I think you do draw it. The distinction between revolutionary ideal and ideal revolution. It's strictly parallel, for example, to, in Lacan, idéal du moi and moi idéal. And this reflexive term, I don't have time to go on it, has, in Hegel, you find at the beginning of second volume of Logic, the same from bestimmte Reflexion, from determinate reflection to reflexive determination. There is a whole wealth there. But let me begin with this very important, I will just, to warm things up a little bit, add some examples which I love of this, how you pointed out this typically Stalinist, and I don't limit Stalinism just to Stalin. It's part of the communist, not only communist culture, this retroactivity, how French Revolution was retroactively read. I always find so wonderfully stupid attempts, for example, do you know this? In East Germany, German Democratic Republic, in the last 15 years approximately of its existence, from mid-1970s, they had this great movement of rehabilitating their German past, as all precisely in the way of French Revolution, pointing towards like Goethe's Faust. We realized it in, and my favorite one is they rehabilitated at the end even Frederick the Great. He became a progressive bourgeois king and so on, pointing towards and so on. But my favorite example is, I remember in late 70s, early 80s, they made a TV series celebrating, of course, it was one of them, Martin Luther. But they had a problem there. Nonetheless, their heroes were also Thomas Müntzer, peasant revolutionaries. So, Luther, apart from short period in the beginning, wasn't exactly for peasant. How to do this? Oh my God, I love this. For things like this, I am nostalgic for coming. You know how they solved in the TV series? You have Münzer visiting Luther. trying to convince him. And you know what Luther tells him? He speaks like today's Marxist. He says, your goal is right. But historically, we are not yet that. Now we are at the period of bourgeois revolution. We need this. 300-400 years later, you know, maybe your time will come. And the same as an old Maoist. You know, they do in China every 10 years, where there is anniversary of 49 victory, they do a new movie of the Chinese victory. And in the last version, which is very Hollywood made, you have Mao pointing towards Deng Xiaoping. You have a famous scene, Mao with a couple of guards walks around Peking, and said, oh my God, I don't have my cigarettes. There is traffic there. Let's go there and buy a cigarette. And his companion tells him, sorry, President, but you know, the owner of the traffic escaped us revolutionaries. I cannot. And you know what Mao says? My God, I cannot even buy my cigarettes. You know what? In some time, even if it take decades, we will have to bring capitalists back, you know. Now, I love this because, as you know, that's the highest semiotic, hermeneutic pleasure of reading communist documents. How? When you have some new movement, change of line. First, it's usually hinted by, oh, you take an author 2,000 years old, we have to change, he is not good, or all of a sudden he is good. You know, for example, in China, I think that one of the signs of cultural revolution was that Mao all of a sudden was for legalists and so on. It was apparently a debate about the first emperor and so on, but let's go on so that I don't get lost in these pure pleasures. I will, of course, it's my duty, but I will try to, not to totally convert you, but just to complicate a little bit. Isn't the paradox, nonetheless, of October Revolution that you can say it was all a manipulation, but Lenin was aware that they won with the slogan, land and peace. It's October Revolution at the beginning. They did, in a way, something similar to French Revolution. They gave land. That's why it was such a shock, like 10 years later, even less, no, 10 years later approximately, the land was taken, was taken away from them. So another point about October Revolution, when you mention this, the power of one and so on, where I like Hegel here was that he tried to, but not in the simple legal way, separation of powers, to draw a distinction between the one, the king, who should, as Hegel puts it, just sign the name. The empty one, the empty master, Hegel says, it doesn't matter if he is an idiot or... And then the experts. But what Hegel saw very well is that you have to have a gap. Expert should not have direct power. There must be a gap. And here I see a problem with Stalinism. Stalin did not pretend to be this empty master. He really... So here, I'm referring, unfortunately, to a book which most of you do not know, Relire la Révolution, when you develop also in some other text of you how, you know, we shouldn't dismiss Stalin as this is the dream of some liberal communist. Everything was perfect in the 20s, Bukharin, blah, blah, and then idiot Stalin comes and says, why don't we kill a couple of millions? No, Stalin did intervene at a certain point of serious deadlock of the Leninist vision. And I agree with you how he brought in the real and all that. But my point would just be this one. I would emphasize at the same time another point which I developed already many times. Nonetheless, in terms of Lacan, was not Stalinism in a way university discourse at its purest? Stalin always presented himself as instrument of the people, expert, knowledge. You know where you can find this? Maybe, just to amuse you, I will give two examples that I often refer to. When I watch old documentaries, you find them now all on YouTube, and you compare big speeches, I'm sorry some of you know this detail, by Stalin and by Hitler. it's typical how when Hitler or fascist leader speaks, at the end the crowd applauds and the leader just receives the applause. A Stalinist leader always stands up and joins the applause. Like, I'm just one of you, and so on and so on. This is also why we don't have time to go into it. Something like the Stalinist show trials, monster trials, is unthinkable in Nazism. It's not because they were better, but it's unthinkable for the Nazis, for example, to organize a big trial against the leading Jews and accuse them of Jewish plot or what. It didn't work that way. Why? Because I think that another thing, you should read them, it's very powerful reading. Now they are sometimes republished. These minutes published of the big Stalinist trials, like recently I read the one from 49-50, Laszlo Reich and all those. What fascinates me so much is that even the lowest trash, and they use all this anal terminology, your trash, vermin, whatever, shit. Nonetheless, at the same time, you are able to assume the position of pure meta-language and explain how did you become that. Like in Laszlo Reich trial, the prosecutor, some big Democrat like Wyszynski or who, I don't know, asks him, how did you become a traitor? And as if from some objective knowledge, Laszlo Reich says, already when I was a young boy, my parents taught me to hate the working class or whatever. You know, my God, where does he talk from? And this goes to the end. In a book, I don't otherwise like it very much, Anne Applebaum, Gulag, I read how in the worst years of Gulag, every year on Stalin's birthday, all inmates were gathered and they had to sign, each of them, a telegram to Stalin, wishing him all the best and so on. In Nazism, this is unthinkable. Collect all the Jews in Auschwitz to send a telegram to Hitler or whatever. So what I'm saying is that even if you are the lowest trash, Stalinism, unfortunately, in this sense, is still part of enlightenment. You may be trash, but there is some neutral knowledge, which is why, remember, Stalin's great text is that philosophy chapter, which is not even attributed to. So I would, that I don't get lost, I would maybe emphasize a little bit more that the madness of Stalinism is nonetheless that its university discourse brought to madness. More this. Second thing, when you said this three phases, revolution and so on, maybe I'm naive here. I don't try to save Lenin. I'm not one of those crazy Trotskyists who think if Lenin were only to survive 3 years longer, he would have made a pact with Trotsky and we would have a wonderful flowering Soviet Union. No, as you pointed out convincingly, Stalin intervened by proposing a certain formula in a deadlock. But nonetheless, what I would add is that wasn't this, in this strict sense, a revolutionary belief, in spite of, you quoted what Trotsky said and so on. I think that in the same way as Leninism itself, it was a Stalinist product. I think that only at that point, this revolution, with Lenin, it's still all much more ambiguous. He is not sure and so on, because we shouldn't forget that Leninism itself is a Stalinist term. It was codified at that point. Let me go quickly so that we don't lose time. Next point, what you say about, I love those parts of his book, where he goes how, in spite of all these problematic points, the French Revolution is the only one with a truly universal appeal. In contrast, you do a very nice critique of Hannah Arendt, who idealized too much the American Revolution. And you point out very nicely that, in a way, it's only Lincoln, with Civil War, that revolution is over, maybe even in the 1960s, and as the last stupid event in the United States show, maybe it's not over even now, you know. So what I'm trying to say is, why don't you mention, you know, the biggest event which made empirically French Revolution a world historical event is for me Haiti Revolution. It was something absolutely extraordinary. You have there half illiterate, if they were not as primitive as they claimed, slave and so on, wanting just to become like French. You know, if you look at some revolutionary scene which makes me cry, it really makes me. You know what happened when Napoleon sent an army there to crush them? But he made a mistake. A strong presence in that army were Polish soldiers. And this is a legendary scene. They approached the slave army, French army. And then, this is a historical fact, they heard some singing. And they said, oh, probably some stupid African tribal songs. When they come closer, they thought they were singing Marseillaise, the slaves. And that's the magic moment. Then, especially Polish, but also some French soldiers said, wait a minute, what if we are on the wrong side? And changed sides. And Napoleon, this was his first, maybe in Spain, defeat and so on. And so this is, I think, part of your argument for the universal appeal, and it's, again, the glory to Jacobins. They immediately accepted it. They are our equal, while even American Revolution, even at its most liberal, radical, Thomas Jefferson, they consider Toussaint Louverture a monster and so on. Now, just if you allow me to finish with two further remarks. One is this one. I agree with you that this type of revolution, what you call revolutionary belief, is over. But where I remain, it's meaningless today, not revolutionary, it's in a very naive, pessimist way. I nonetheless think that we are approaching on many levels, refugees, ecology, intellectual property, a certain deadlock, and something will have to happen. I'm not ready to engage in any easy predictions in what way. In this totally formal way, I remain not a revolutionary, but like something will have to change, because if it will not change, then it will change nonetheless, but in a much worse way. So, but now the point which may surprise you, that I mention it. My final point, I like very much in another text where you said something about what repelled you from Maoism. When you got it, that I'm sorry if I simplify you. When you said that, like you noticed that in Mao and so on, I'm simplifying you now. You should find human lives don't count, to put it. Survival doesn't count. It's not only this, it's another thing, I'm sorry if some of you already know it, which shocked me. Do you know Mao's speech, I think it's 59, at Lushan conference, which shocked me with its obscenity. It was after the obvious failure of the Great Leap Forward, it was a moment of self-critique. Mao said, we have openly to admit, me the first, thousands of people died, we made horrible mistakes. And then, this is not hidden in, it's the final paragraph of the text, that metaphors are never neutral. That shocked me. You know what Mao, maybe you know what Mao says there. I mean, I'm ashamed to pronounce these words here. He makes a comparison between this self-critique and, what's the vulgar word for flatulence? Farting. He said, if you want to shit, shit. If you feel a need to fart, you will feel better. That's how we should do our critique here. Now, you know, he's talking about confessing openly guilt about an immense catastrophe. And in what sense does he use this as a metaphor? Like, this throws a totally new light on this self-criticism if you compare it with these activities and so on. But the very last thing to provoke you about cultural revolution, you know where I'm, would you agree? And this brought me a violent reply from Badiou, of course. I said that I'm here very Hegelian, like, List der Vernunft, cunning of reason into what things turn. I think that in the way that you said that the Chinese reproach to Soviet Union was you brought revisionism, Khrushchev, and so on. But can't we say retroactively that the actual result of Cultural Revolution is Deng Xiaoping? It erased tradition, it emptied the slate, and it created these disoriented individuals, the ideal playground for let's introduce the market now and so on. So that's what hardline Maoists who still are cannot accept, that Deng Xiaoping was not simply a betrayal. In some deeper Hegelian sense, he is maybe even the result of it. But okay, you can choose whatever of my confused ramblings. I would just like, if you just give, where do you stand? Am I a pessimist too much? Do you agree that at some level we are approaching some critical point? And that, I'm not saying now we need that revolution, definitely not. I'm just saying that in some way things will happen if we want it or not. My pessimism is that the true utopia is that our relative welfare, the way we have it now, can go on indefinitely. You know, we should just be silent, modest, sacrifice. No, it will not go on. We are approaching serious times. This is the only reason that I remain not leftist, and I even don't know what will it be, but like things will have to change radically, for good or for bad. I'm sorry if I was too long, please. Strike back, harsh.
I shall begin by the end. What you were saying about the result of Cultural Revolution, I hold the same point of view.
And it's not well received, probably, by...
No, it was not. It seems to me that what the Cultural Revolution in some way proved is that it's very easy to destroy a class, while the same was not true for French Revolution. French Revolution did not think in terms of destroying a class. Well, of course, the noblemen were deprived of their privileges and so on and so on. But the idea of killing all the noblemen was never considered. The only moment where the question may have been raised is a question of the priest, which is a dramatic question. But nevertheless, the idea, and for instance, Robespierre never thought that priests should disappear completely. While in China, in Chinese Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, the idea, which is quite different from what happened in the first part of the Chinese Revolution, was that a whole class, namely the class of the intellectually, well, the students, well, let's say, people who had nothing else, property has disappeared, but what remained was intellectual property, I mean the property of its own talent. This should disappear. And Cultural Revolution tried to do so, and in fact achieved that. For instance, it's clear, all the documents are there, people died, but also books were burned. It was impossible to study anything. The notion of talent was completely erased. The fact that it's easy to obtain, to get such a result.
No, that's all. I'm just really grateful to both of you and to the audience. It's almost 8 o'clock, and they haven't shown any
That's what
signs
I
of
wanted.
throwing us
Now we
out.
have 1 minute for
No,
a debate.
No. Yeah, no, you'd be so lucky. I'm going to pass the microphone to people who do want to ask a question. If you don't mind, we can take them all together. Is that all right?
I'm getting senile. If there are more than 3, I forget
Okay,
them.
3, but yeah, can we do that? So, and you're okay answering a few
But
questions,
please,
yeah?
he is our guest.
Anyone who wants to?
Is this one there? Like said before about the Haitian revolution. Where do you stand on the Haitian revolution? Thank you.
And the Black Jacobins and CNF James.
Do you want me to
Yeah.
answer that? Yeah. It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because it was not completely understood. It was, let's say, abstractedly understood by some part of the revolutionaries, but it was not completely understood. There is a great difference between slavery in France and in slavery in the United States. Slavery was not something that people knew. It was an abstract notion. They knew it existed, of course. Some people made money by selling, by trading. Voltaire, for instance, made it seems, a lot of money. But I don't think he ever saw a slave. That's a big difference with the United States, where slavery was something that could be seen every day, at least in some states. So the position about slavery and the rights of slaves was an abstraction, and people who sided with the Haitian Revolution sided with it for abstract reasons, and in fact, for abstract reasons, Hannah Arendt would say, with a sort of very haughtily, that they were moved by compassion. It was more than pure compassion, it was also a political argument, but it was abstract. So when the lobby, because there was a lobby of slave owners, spoke in terms that were, let's say, quote Marx, concrete, saying, well, prosperity is based on slavery and things like that. Well, there was no answer. So.
We have 3 more questions. Do you want to take them all together or one? 3.
No.
Hi, this is directed at both Slavoj and Mr. Milner. It regards what he was talking about, the reciprocity between the states, that the stability of one is always thought of as guaranteeing its safety and so on, and the European Union. And I know how dangerous comparisons are, but I don't want to make them. It's just food for thought. And thinking about Yugoslavia as well, and Slovenia, and leaving, and I don't want to make that. What can they throw back in relation to this, and where things were and how things are?
You touched a very sensitive point, because I will be very brief. Did you notice this absolutely disgusting hypocrisy that the same leftists who, at that point when Yugoslavia was falling apart, said, no, this is some dark, I don't know, neo-Nazi Vatican plot, which were absolutely for Yugoslav unity, are now fully for Catalonia. Yes, for Catalonian autonomy, and the other way around. Those many right-wingers in Europe who supported the dispersal of Yugoslavia are now absolutely supporting the unity of Spain and so on. It's clear that there are some other geopolitical problems here. But I would like to ask you something else, which just don't you see that this already with the problem about which you wrote some wonderful lines of refugees, this fiasco of Europe began? That there was no united politics and the worst possible thing happened. This totally chaotic situation. Then what is emerging now, what I'm almost tempted to call the new axis of evil, Croatia, Slovenia, Hungary, Poland, those countries who even they pretend to, that's the beautiful paradox that I like. They are at the same time anti-Semitic and anti-Arab, you know. That's a true axis of evil. And again, this total disorientation of Europe. At the end, my God, the Hungarian guy? Orban. I always confuse him. I always like this Urbi et Orbi. We had Urbi, now we had Orbi. That Orban will win. Silently, he is already winning. So the fiasco that you are mentioning began there already, if not earlier.
Well,
I'm sorry.
I wouldn't disagree necessarily with you, because if you look closely at on the question of refugees, something that is not always mentioned is the fact that France, for instance, was very parsimonious. Why? Because in fact, the question of refugees was connected with the question of immigration, which is completely different. Immigration in France, immigration is connected with the fact that people are living definitely or for a long period of time on the French soil. Some of them become French citizens, or are already French citizens, because in the term immigré, people include very easily children of immigré, children who are legally French citizens. So the question of refugees is quite different, because refugees in France generally do not want to become French and do not want to live in France. So what appeared is that according to the various countries, Germany, for instance, has a big problem, which is the fact that its population is declining in number, is growing old, and so the question of retirement pensions is becoming difficult. Well, not very difficult, but it will become difficult. So the possibility of having a certain number of refugees solves a question or problem, while in France it would not solve the same problem. It will in fact make it more difficult. So what appeared is that what had functioned in a sort of system that was in fact, protected from the disorders of the world, and whose sole question was to be stable in itself. Like, let's say, a physical system must be stable in itself because, well, it may be stable because it is protected from the outside. Well, the question was, Europe is not anymore protected from the outside. It was a new fact. It was a new fact. It is completely different from the fact that Turks were arriving in Germany, or North Africans were arriving in France. That was part of the stabilization. That was not a problem. While what was happening there was a destabilization. And it was a destabilization that affected the main countries of Europe. If Europe is destabilized, well, it has no use. So people like Orban will be quite. It will be quite easy for him to say, well, Europe is useless, so let's go out of Europe, or let's treat Europe as a milking cow, just for the milk it gives.
Just two more last questions we'll take together, if that's all right, and then we can take.
Hello. So I'm not very well versed in philosophy lately. I've studied it maybe a few years ago. But for what I remember, in Marxist theory, there was also like the kind of the monopolization of the medium of production. You know, in this historical period, we're seeing kind of new tools of domination, like information and technology. So how does history evolve when these new powerful tools of domination that create new classes, new dominant classes? You know, how does that play in that cycle that you were talking about, that you both were talking about? And I would like to hear both of you guys.
You mean that cycle, monarchy, oligarchy, and so on? That big.
Yes, because we have this new, data and information that are really changing the way that we are subjected to power.
That's a good point. I think Jean-Claude does mention social media in terms of autocracy at some point. Can we take the last question together, and then you can answer both of them? Because we were supposed to leave this room at 8.
So you mentioned in your talk a cycle of different kinds of governments decaying from one to the next, and you described democracy as decaying into rule by crowd, which some people would describe as populism. I wonder if you think that's an accurate description of this rule by crowd, if you see that as what's happening now with populism in the United States, here, Spain, and elsewhere, and if that's the case, do you think populism is always something bad?
I think the two questions go well together.
Well, your question and the preceding question are somehow connected in my mind. The new technologies have defined a new type of crowd. There is a quarrel today, the last 3 days in France about the question about a formula that was used by President Macron. La démocratie, ça n'est pas la rue. Democracy is not street. And I was struck by the fact that people argued as if the street was still the place for the crowd. But I don't think that's true anymore. The crowd, from the point of view of the new technology, that's Facebook, that's Twitter, and so on and so on. So when President Trump tweets, it has more to do with ochlocracy in the sense of Polybius than with monarchy or tyranny. If you think of Hitler made use of what was a modern technology at his time, that is radio. And the voice of Hitler was in fact the basis of his power, because radio was in fact the basis of it was the place where the crowd was really built. So the idea that crowds are connected with open spaces, that it's Nuremberg, the streets, I think that's not true anymore. Sometimes a crowd was radio, or it was the movies. Today it's clear that internet is a place for the crowd. So ochlocracy is taking new form. And talking about destabilization, it's clear that internet has a power of destabilization that is incomparable with the destabilization that the street could produce. The street is something that could be dominated by pure physical force. The internet, it's quite different. So I think, yes, the notion, various notion of crowd, of stabilization, of power are affected by the apparition of new technologies. So that's the reason why your two questions were connected.
Very briefly, because so that we are not thrown out. First, just I want to reply, yes, when you said Hitler voice, wasn't this wonderfully intuited by Charlie Chaplin, the great dictator, where Hitler is literally, first you see him as a creature of voice, shouting and so on. It is as if with normal people, although it's not as simple as that, voice is the property of me. But with Hitler, it's as if his body is attached to the voice. It's just, okay, let's not lose time here. I want to just to mention this point about how you say about internet destabilizing. That's why, for example, how obsessed the big one, People's Republic, China is with controlling internet. They see this and how, with what irrational, okay, maybe it's not irrational strength they do it, but I want to do another thing. I'm sorry we don't have time, because I think all with this new media, new relations of power, I think that it's also, even if he may be the richest man, Bill Gates and so on, but it's no longer the classical bourgeoisie. Because if you first think, I don't know enough about economy, but I'm tempted to accept it, that if you look at, for example, Microsoft, it's not the classical exploitation profiteering, it's more that through monopolizing the field of hardware, software, for communication, we are paying him a rent to participate in the commons, like you have, or it's the same with Amazon. They almost monopolize certain distributions, and it's no longer like, even Bill Gates is even paying his workers, there are just 1,000 to 3,000 or what, relatively well, and he doesn't even think in these terms. That's how a certain product, the new version of Windows, costs me, I should add a profit rate and so on. The price of new windows has practically no relation whatsoever to the production costs. I think that you, in your book, it's again not translated, and as a Stalinist, I'd say we should call our NKVD, KGB friends to inquire who is sabotaging this. Because he wrote a wonderful short book on this notion of salaried bourgeoisie. That today we have, even if, a typical wealth today, it's a different way. It's a highly paid manager who gets a salary. It's no longer the old type of bourgeoisie. And just the last point here, a new type of, I'm ashamed to use the term public intellectual, but in the lowest sense they are, is emerging, and I'm almost afraid more of them than of Trump and so on. People like Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk. I'm horrified when some idiot like Zuckerberg appears in our media and gives common advices, that's what to do for humanity, and so on and so on. I find something, this is the new ochlocracy, which I find terrifying. I stop.
Yeah.
Just a point. In Marxist term, you could argue that the real exploited workers whose working force is producing the Mehrwert,
surplus value,
surplus value for Twitter, Facebook, etc., are the users of this technology. So, in fact, each time I don't tweet, but each time I tweet, in fact, my working time is the time I'm writing my tweet, and this is the time where the surplus value is produced for the owner of the Twitter technology. So the notion of exploitation and the notion of surplus value and working force are also distributed in a different way.
That's why in my ideal new humanist totalitarian state, prohibit Twitter, prohibit Facebook. That would be my rule. Sorry. That's my small idea. I'm sorry.
Didn't Lacan's, long before Twitter, say that he refused to give his teaching in bite-sized pieces? It's almost like he predicted Twitter, and this is what Twitter is trying to do, give us everything in bite-sized chunks.
Yeah, but it's not just there. If you look political debates on American TV, you cannot even develop a basic line of argumentation. It's just, if you get 30 seconds, it's almost a miracle. So just this, you should shout quickly something you know.
Yeah. Well, I can't imagine a better way to start the weekend. We've had so many beautiful ideas to ponder. Rather than choose between the two of you, can I quote from a third person, like Balibar, who's also been talking about revolutions recently in Greece. And he suggests, he says, that our century is one where the opposite of Rousseau's prophecy seems to be the case. It's not the imminent return of revolutions, but the exhaustion of the idea, or at least the failure of revolutions. But also to go back to Beckett, that his